Good evening, everybody.
Turn your mic on.
Thank you so much for coming out on this incredibly cold evening in January. We're so pleased that you're all here for another great discussion in our speaker series this year on freedom of speech. To kick off our conversation this evening and to introduce our phenomenal speakers, we have Hallie Carroll. And Hallie, come on up, Hallie. Hallie is a student member of our Goldfarb Student Executive Board. Hallie, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Goldfarb event of 2022. As Kimberly said, my name is Hallie Carroll, and I'm on the Goldfarb Student Executive Board, and it is my honor tonight to present these two incredible people. Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers are two radical political activists who have been teaching during Colby's Jan Plan for about 10 years now. I've been a fan and admirer of them ever since I was introduced to their work during a class I took on the history of radical politics, where we watched a documentary made about them called The Weather Underground and studied their anti-war activism in the 60s and 70s. I cannot express enough how excited I am to hear from them. Professor Dorn is an activist, academic, and advocate, and she is a retired law professor from the Northwestern University School of Law, where she was the founding director of the Children and Family Justice Center for 23 years. She is the author of multiple books, including a book she co-authored with her husband, Professor Eyers, titled Race Course Against White Supremacy. Professor Eyers is the formerly Distinguished Professor of Education and Senior University Scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has written extensively about social justice, democracy, and education, and is an award-winning author and editor of well over a dozen books, including Teaching Toward Freedom and a 2001 memoir, Fugitive Days, Memoirs of an Anti-War Activist. Please give a warm welcome on this very cold night to Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hallie. And thank you as well to all of those who we know are watching online. We hope you are cozy and comfortable at home. So this talk this evening is, like I mentioned at the beginning, part of a series of conversations that we are having this year related to freedom of speech. Every year, the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs chooses a theme, and this year's theme was chosen by our Student Executive Board. And I think a lot of it was around looking at the divisiveness that we've seen in our nation, looking at the role of social media and other elements around freedom of speech. But we've really broadened that in what we've looked at so far. So some of the speakers that we've had, for example, we kicked it off with Nadine Strossen, the former ACLU president, talking about fighting hate speech. We also had conversations looking at free speech protections on campus. And our last event, we had Nathan Law coming to speak to us from London, where he's in political exile himself, related to the crackdown on free speech in Hong Kong. And also in the fall, we had a faculty-led discussion looking at does free speech give us better science? So we've covered a lot of different topics related to this idea of freedom and freedom of speech. And it was actually a member of our faculty advisory council, committee, Professor Adam Howard, who many of you know in education, who recommended that we have a Jan Plan event. Normally, around this time, we are gearing up to go to DC for a big event called Hill to Hill, which we were unable to do again this year. But since we're here, we thought, let's bring some visiting professors who know a thing or two about activism and freedom of speech, and particularly looking at this, in terms of what it means in the classroom. So we'll probably talk about a range of issues today. As always, this will be a free-flowing conversation, and we will be taking questions from you as well. So be thinking about what you want to ask these amazing people that we have on our campus this month and with us here on the stage tonight. So I'd like to start with asking a question I've been asking a lot of our speakers in this series, which is just very simply, what does freedom of speech mean to you? Which can mean a lot of different things, whether that's related to the classroom issue that we might talk about more tonight. Let's start with you.
Well, I think freedom of speech means freedom to think. I mean, if you can't speak and your thoughts are only in your head, then you're maybe Emily Dickinson or something writing up in an attic, but otherwise you're actually in the world and participating in the world. So to me, freedom of speech is critical. It's also complicated, and it's really it's about the citizens being able to speak up. You know, the First Amendment is really about the government, and that, and we won't go into a legal analysis of that because that's it's a somewhat different series of issues. But I think, to me, it's utterly about being human and being able to grow and being able to think out loud, think with your friends, think with your opposition. You know, I can't imagine coming to positions about things without arguing about it. I think that's at the heart of things.
Yeah, I'm sure your kitchen table conversations are quite interesting. What do you think when you think of freedom of speech?
Well, I'll amplify a couple of points Bernadine made. On the one hand, there's a formal, when we say freedom of speech in this country in particular, we think of the First Amendment, and there's a formality to it, a legalistic kind of thing, and we could talk about case law and so on. And the First Amendment, many people don't understand, basically says the government shall make no law regarding religion or freedom of speech or the press. So it's really about the government. So when somebody says to me, I get to say this because I have free speech, I'm not the government, I'm not making laws, you know, so we should make a distinction. But I want to turn it immediately to the classroom.
Sure.
You know, so to me, Bernadine said that freedom of speech has to include freedom to think. And if you're kind of, you know, buzzed out and not able to think critically about the world, then your freedom of speech as a formality means nothing. So I think one of my touchstones as a teacher, I started teaching in the early 1960s, and one of my touchstones was the freedom schools in Mississippi. That was part of the freedom movement, the Black freedom movement in the South, which you know about as the Civil Rights Movement. But in 1963, Charlie Cobb, a volunteer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wrote a proposal. And it wasn't a proposal to the MacArthur Foundation or the Education Department. It was a proposal to his friends. And he made a Xerox copy, and you can Google Xerox later to understand what that is. He just made copies of this thing and handed it out to friends. And in his proposal, he said, and he was writing it in the interest of re-energizing the freedom movement, which had its ups and downs. And what he said was, the Black children of Mississippi have been denied many things: decent schools, decent facilities, forward-looking curriculum, fully trained teachers. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. Think about that for a minute. Mississippi, 1963. That's a revolutionary thing to say. You have a right to think for yourself about the circumstances of your life and how it might be otherwise. You could bring that up to date and say it about any group of kids. The kids on the west side of Chicago, the kids in the South Bronx, have been denied many things: decent facilities, forward-looking curriculum, but the fundamental injury is the failure to encourage students to think for themselves. And that's where I go with free speech immediately. I want to say, you have to, the main lesson kids have to learn here at Colby, but in high school as well and all throughout school, is you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You have every right to interrogate the world. And that calls on you to take responsibility for interrogating the world. And that's how I think of freedom of speech.
And tell us more about those freedom schools. Did that proposal go anywhere with the friends? And kind of onto that is, could that work today, or how does that apply today?
Yeah, not only did it go somewhere, this proposal from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led to the Freedom Summer. And some of you know the history of the Civil Rights Movement and know that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were three martyrs of Mississippi. What you may not know, they were kidnapped and lynched, and it was a very big event in the story of the Civil Rights Movement. But what you may not know is they were freedom school teachers, and they were investigating the arson bombing of a freedom school when they were kidnapped by the sheriff and taken off into the woods and lynched. So it was a revolutionary, threatening idea, and I think it still is. But it led to a whole series of freedom schools throughout the South. And freedom schools were not schools as you think of, brick and mortar, you know, a building. They took place in the park, in the community center, in a church basement. They were community-led, and they were part of a political upheaval. And they played a huge role in re-energizing the civil rights movement in 1964. You can find the curriculum online. The curriculum is called the 1964 Mississippi Freedom School Curriculum. And it's a curriculum of questions. And it begins with what they call the fundamental questions. Why are you and I in the freedom movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What does the majority culture have that we want? What do we have that we want to maintain? From there, it becomes a whole energizing project of empowering people to ask their own questions, to seek their own answers, to investigate their own lives, and to posit the possibility of something different. Could it be done today? It is being done today. And that's the good news. There are Freedom School, not only curricula, but Freedom School efforts really all over the country. Oakland, Chicago, LA, San Francisco. It's alive and it's well, but I urge you to look it up.
I think one way it's alive now, can I jump in?
Of course, yes.
Is we should all give a moment of thanks to Nikole Hannah-Jones, because she has managed to infuriate a significant number of people who think that we should restrict what we think about and what we talk about and what our history is and how we keep rediscovering history in the United States that is very very present and immediate in our lives today. So I feel like Black Lives Matter and Undocumented and Unafraid, all of the movements from below that are pushing us today to rethink about history and the present and the relationship between those things. She's managed to put it on the table with a very elegant book and a very elegant rewriting of history. And so she's one of my heroes. I think she's just done a great job, independent of each little piece of information at really reinvigorating a conversation that is, in a way, the American conversation.
Well, I was gonna say that, but you even just flowed into that beautifully with the American conversation. Is a lot of times when we've talked about this, we've talked about what is uniquely American. Whether that's looking at our issues here versus another global or another country's perspective, our laws. So curious to dive a little deeper of what is it about America that's different, both good and bad, in terms of freedom of speech?
Well, I don't know enough to do comparative analysis really, but I think that one of the unique things is, I think it's, for example, I think it's very much happening in Canada. You have a story, a myth about origins and about how your people got here, and then how your people made a new country and a new nation. And then you look more closely, or you're taught to think about the indigenous people of Canada or the United States and what their story is and how their story exposes, a very ugly underside of white supremacy, of racism, of imperialism, of taking over other people's land, of genocide. And so that kind of revelation is ongoing. That's one of the extraordinary things about it. It's not looked at once. It's a subject not just for writers or investigators. It's a subject for artists. It's a subject for people working every day in every form of life. So I think it's a participatory revelation. It's a participatory investigation, and it's new and old, very immediate right now.
I think that what's great, and I agree with Bernadine, that it's a global phenomenon, but what's great about being here now, being young people in college now, is that there's a whole opening to rethink everything from the bottom up, to look at the crises that we're surrounded by: governmental crisis, economic crisis, pandemic crisis, crisis of racial reckoning, crisis of empire, and to say, what should we do about it? What can we do about it? And then you have writers like Nikole Hannah-Jones, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote The Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And you can suddenly, in a very exciting way, rethink all the myths that we grew up with. When I think about free speech, going back to where Bernadine began, and the ability to think, What worries me is not only what I think of as a very powerful right-wing push. You know, this January 6th, we're just beyond January 6th, but that's not the end of it. It's not a one-day event. It's still going on. So we need to reckon with all these things. But I think that what's exciting about this moment is that we can reckon with them, looking at not only our origin myths, but also what's going on now that challenges and allows us to open space to really inquire. Bernadine started by saying the ability to think, and what worries me is not just the kind of, if you think of the great two classics of American classic, not American, British classics of what the future could hold in terms of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. There's 1984, and the symbol of, which you all know, 1984, the symbol is the boot, the chain, the torture chamber, the club. But then you also have Brave New World, and by Aldous Huxley. And Brave New World posits a different example, and that is that people are free, but they have nothing to say. People can say anything, but they don't want to say anything. And it's that dystopic image worries me enormously, that you end up with a formal right to speak, but you have nothing to say. Well, then what good is the formal right? You know, and there's this moment in Brave New World where the main character says to his girlfriend, but don't you ever want to be free? And she says, I am free. I'm free to enjoy soma, which is the drug of choice. I'm free to, enjoy a sexual life. I'm free. And he said, no, but I mean, something different, free. And she says, I am free. And it's like, you get this feeling that everybody's hypnotized, everybody's mesmerized, but they're free in some formal sense. That worries me a lot. The right to think, and you have nothing to say.
Yeah. Do you feel like, especially given your personal histories and being so active, in the 60s and early 70s, do you feel like that we have, how do I say this, like that the trend has gone towards that we are more free than ever before? Or do you feel like we're just recycling the same issues over and over in different ways?
I don't think I would say we're recycling the issues, but I also wouldn't make the claim that we're more free than ever before. I think there's a kind of a narcissism in imagining that that's true. I think that freedom is always contested. I think the future is completely, the reason, I'm not an optimist, although I'm often accused of being an optimist.
He is an optimist.
No, I'm not an optimist.
She might know.
I am not an optimist. Because I think of an optimist as the flip side of a pessimist.
Yeah.
An optimist knows what's coming. So does a pessimist, sitting on the couch being cynical. I know it's going to all turn out crappy. But I have no idea what's coming. And because I have no idea, I choose a politics of hopefulness, because what we do or don't do could indeed make a difference. It's interesting to look even briefly at history and note that every revolution the day before it happened was impossible. And the day after it happened, it was inevitable. Think of Rosa Parks on the bus. The day before she sat down, we weren't going to change the South. We weren't going to undo American apartheid. The day after she sat down, yes, this is happening. It's not so simple as just one person, but the point is, you don't know what's coming. And because I don't know, that makes me want to be hopeful.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I want to add to a different element. I've taught children's rights and worked around the definition of who children are, and with minds and hearts and thoughts and activism and anger, and children are fully human from the moment that they're born, and how we. So I'll give you an example from when I was first in college and in law school. One of the breakthrough cases around speech is called Tinker versus Des Moines School District, and it was in Iowa, and the students, it was during the Vietnam War, and the students in the high school, not all, but a majority of them showed up one day with armbands, black armbands against the war. Just very, no action, no rocks through the window, no stopping somebody else from speaking, just the armbands. And that case went to the Supreme Court as a speech question. Do they have a right to speech? And the court, strangely enough, did actually support their right to speech, that kind of speech, a coherent, organized stance that said, we're against this war, we're going to ruin our lives, it's going to shape the rest of our lives, stop it now. Silently, and it's such a perfect case, and plus the name Tinker versus Des Moines School District, such a great, memorable example to me of, where law and reality and activism, and what speech is. There was no speech involved in that case, just for example.
Yeah. What advice, and I probably didn't write it down right, but you talked about at the beginning that you don't need permission to interrogate. Did I say that right?
You need no one's permission to interrogate the world.
There you go. So how would you advise, particularly college students at Colby, how do they do that? What advice do you give them, especially in the classroom? That can be intimidating.
It can be, but I should start by saying Bernadine and I have been very, very strong in the last couple of decades of saying we don't really have advice for young people. They mainly have advice for us. And we feel lucky in Chicago when the Black Lives Matter kids let us be part of their movement, and we feel great about that. So
although usually we're at the back end of their, it's hard to keep up with them, really what we're saying, but we're trying.
But I would frame it not as advice, but I would say that it's worth knowing for college students, for high school students, for young people, for old people, that there is a rhythm to activism. And it's the same rhythm as being a good citizen or being a moral person or being a hopeful person. And the rhythm is simple to say and excruciating to live. And the rhythm is this: you have to open your eyes. You can't make ethical, moral, political decisions, social decisions, if you don't pay attention. So you have to open your eyes, not once, not twice, every day in a new way. You have to see the world as it is. And since we're finite creatures in an infinite and expanding universe, we only see a speck of the world. But we have to open our eyes and keep trying to see more. And then we have to be astonished. We have to be astonished at both the beauty and the love and the ecstasy and the human interactions all around us. And we have to be astonished at the terrible suffering that human beings visit upon one another. And we should be astonished each time anew. Don't get used to seeing homeless children in Chicago. Be astonished that that's true. Don't get used to the fact that we are a country with massive homeless population, hungry people in this rich country, people who can't access health care. It's crazy. So be astonished about that. And then you have to act. That's step 3. You have to do something. And often my students will say to me, well, I can't do everything, especially if they hear me go on and on about every damn issue in the world. I can't do everything. And the answer to that is you don't have to do everything. You have to do something. And something is where we start. And then you have to doubt. You have to rethink. You have to reflect. You have to wonder if what you did was as good as you thought it was. And then you start the cycle again. And if you can kind of keep on that track, keep opening your eyes, keep being astonished, keep acting, keep doubting, and then repeat. That's, to me, the rhythm of being a good citizen.
Although we didn't always keep doubting. Well, in our history.
That was our big problem.
We were very certain for a decade or so.
If you don't add the 4th element of doubt or rethinking, you become self-righteous, and self-righteousness leads to dogmatism. And so on.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Are there things that you have changed, like on a personal note, over the decades of looking back at your life, Bernadine, of things that you felt strongly about it one way and then you've shifted your perspective?
I don't think so.
Yeah?
That does sound like I'm not open. I think that I've, I certainly don't feel that I have the answers. That's a big change for me. I think that I really look to young people for guidance about how they're making their way in the world and what they plan to do and how they'll let themselves be changed by circumstances. I think it's, I highly recommend imagining somebody who you want to be your mentor. It may be an author, it may be a scientist, it may be a Nobel Prize winning person, it may be somebody, that's beyond your reach. And I have two ideas about that. One is, go apprentice yourself to somebody you admire. Try to see if you can work for them for the summer or for an extended period of time, or if they'll give you an assignment. But get close to the issues that you're interested in. Brian Stevenson, do you know who he is? He says get proximate to the issue that you're interested in. Put yourself closely to it. That's what he did. He took himself from a modest but intellectual childhood and put himself in the middle of the Deep South, representing people who were on death row. And it's led to many more things as he links the issues, and he mentors people from all over the world who now come there to work with him. So, I recommend going there for inspiration. If you haven't been to the Lynching Museum and to the monument, what's it called?
The Peace and Justice Monument
Memorial.
in Montgomery.
In Montgomery, Alabama. Astonishing life that he's built, but he's just one example of somebody you might want to put yourself proximate to, but it might be, a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, an author, an artist somewhere. But it's surprisingly accessible to you to go put yourself proximate to someone who you admire and see where that takes you. So I was very sheltered, didn't grow up in a radical environment. My parents voted 4 times for Joe McCarthy in Wisconsin when he was trying to arrest, seeing reds under every bed. And I knew nothing about it. But I went to the got myself to the University of Chicago, and then Dr. King was going to come to Chicago. And I just said to myself, if I don't do this, I didn't go south. I didn't have the courage to go south. I thought about it, and I didn't do it. And if now Dr. King and organizers from the South are coming to Chicago, I'll always regret it if I don't put myself into it. And so he had meetings with lawyers and law students, and I took a delegation of law students to that meeting. And I found out I didn't really want to work with the lawyers as much as I wanted to work with the organizers on the west side of Chicago. But, it definitely put me in a world and a context of organizing and activism. And by the end of that year, it was a year of demonstrating and trying to get attention to housing that was not habitable and violated all the building codes in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago. By the end of that year, everybody that I was around was asking me about the draft, and was there a way that they or their children didn't have to go to Vietnam to fight what was increasingly an immoral war. So, the issues were in the flow. I didn't put them together, I didn't understand how they fit together. But I think that's what it means to put yourself, in a position where you're being pushed and educated, and that, for me, that changed the whole course of my life.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, and a good example for not just young people, but for all of us, that if you open your eyes and you see the world and you see what the problems are, you should put yourself near somebody who's working on that problem. And if you do that for a summer or a semester or a term or just after college, that's a way to kind of help you opening your eyes. We both have felt that over many, many decades. We've been together for 5 decades, so it's a long time. Just getting started. But we have often felt that if you're not pissed off, then you're not paying attention. If you pay attention, you're going to be pissed off. But if you're only pissed off, you're not going to go where you need to go. So somehow you have to live in the contradiction of seeing both the horrors and the unfairness and the injustice all around us, and also live with an idea, a hopeful idea that we can make something better together. And so only love and generosity will get us where we want to go. But you also have to begin by knowing that the world is out of balance. And it's out of balance for you, and it's out of balance for your fellow humans. And that takes me, Bernadine said, get proximate to the poor, get proximate to the people you want to work with. The other way I would say it is, the opposite of moral is not immoral. The opposite of moral is indifferent. And if you're indifferent, that's the same as being immoral, because you're not paying attention to what's right in front of you. And you can say, well, I didn't know, but you do know. And if you open your eyes, you'll know more.
Yeah. And other people around you know more. So I'll tell you one other funny story. When I was at the University of Chicago, the first sit-in happened, and I was not connected with any struggle. This was before law school. And you know who organized the first sit-in at the University of Chicago about racist housing owned by the University of Chicago all over the South Side. So the university was at that moment the second largest landowner in Chicago. The Catholic Church was the first, but the university was the second. And these students got together and spent the summer working with the Congress of Racial Equality. And they sent in, all over the South Side where the university owned buildings, rented buildings, they sent in an African-American couple who were turned down, who looked at the apartment and offered to rent it. Rent it. And were turned down, followed within hours by a white couple who came and got it. So it was, you know, kind of not a sophisticated piece of research, really, but it was devastating. And then they said, let us sit in. And you know who led the sit-in? I can show you many pictures of the first sit-in, because I was not part of it, afraid to be part of it. Bernie Sanders was in my class. How weird is that? So he led the first sit-in. He was working with the Congress of Racial Equality that summer, and they occupied the administration building, demanding that they stop having discriminatory housing on the South Side of Chicago. And it was so shocking, because I loved the University of Chicago, and I was so happy to be there. And it was so shocking to me that that's who they were. So that's just a funny example of where, you know, in my class reunions, his picture always comes up.
Do you stay in touch?
He's giving a speech, and he's wearing, you know, a sports jacket and a shirt.
But the other thing that's a great example of, which is something that any of us can do, which is participatory popular research. Research doesn't have to be some hidden off in the archives or, you know, in the academy. Research can be done by ordinary people getting together and saying, what do we want to find out? What do we want to investigate? Let's do it. In Chicago, when Bernadine was there, it was segregated housing. But you could talk about anything. The siting of waste materials, garbage dumps. Where are they sited in New York City and in Boston? Where are they put in Chicago? In which neighborhoods and why? And people do that kind of research, and that leads to a kind of activism that is very exciting.
You know, when we were thinking about this event, Bill, we had a lot of different titles floating around. But the one that we settled on, which now I'm trying to remember, I think it was Conflict and Contradiction. Is that what we settled?
Right.
What was on your mind when you had that idea? What were you thinking about?
Well, what I was thinking about is that free speech in the classroom. So we ended up calling this event Free Speech in the Classroom, Conflict and Contradiction. We also had another idea, the right to think at all, which is at risk. But conflict and contradiction, what I mean by that is often when you talk about things like free speech, you're talking about rights in conflict. You're not talking about, it's not like you get to say everything you believe in. The problem with endorsing an idea like I believe in freedom of speech, it can lead to a kind of formalistic everybody's allowed to say what they want. But it can also lead to an understanding that will put us in conflict. I have to defend the right of people to speak on the things that I find loathsome. In other words, I don't think that the government should make rules that say you can't think this is outside. And frankly, we're living at a time almost unprecedented. It's always been true that there are groups of people trying to ban books. That's why I'm wearing my t-shirt that says read banned books if you're not. Because that's always been true. And in some ways, it's a natural part of a public education system that people will fight over what's appropriate. But we are in an unprecedented time where a legislator in Texas is recommending that they excise something like 500 books from every library in Texas. In Iowa, it's been proposed that any parent can come into any school and take out any book that they think is inappropriate. And this becomes a very dangerous kind of thing. And that reminds me of another dystopic novel, which is Fahrenheit 451, which many of you know that book. But the important thing, I think, to remember about Fahrenheit 451 is when the captain, Beatty, the fire chief, if you don't know the book, the fire department's job is not to put out fires, it's to find books and burn them, and when the captain is asked, why do you burn books? His response is, the people demand that we burn books. Mm-hmm. Why do they demand it? Because adjectives and adverbs and all this stuff is so damn confusing. We just want to know what's right. So burn all the books that make all that confusion. That's what I fear.
Speaking of, and I mentioned this to Bill when I saw his very cool shirt, know that the Goldfarb Center is working with the library and the special archives here at Colby, and we're going to be doing a display, or we'll be doing a display related to our freedom of speech and banned books this year.
Nice.
So look for that this spring semester. We should turn to the audience because we've enjoyed talking to each other so long. I realized we should include you in this lovely conversation. So we have Willa and Lynn that have microphones. And as you ask a question, the drill, please say your name or major or what you teach if you're a professor. And be bold. Keep your eyes open. Who has a question?
Do not be shy.
Don't be shy.
We only have a little time together.
What questions do you have? I know some of the audience, and you know I will call you out if you don't ask a question. So.
Uh-oh, it's a threat.
There we go. There you go.
Hi. This is a very basic question. Oh,
yeah, you gotta give your intro first.
I'm Razel. I'm an anthro major. And this is a very basic question, but I was wondering about your thoughts on the role of social media in activism, and I'm especially thinking about Yik Yak and other anonymous forms of posting that are very prevalent on campus.
Do you guys know what Yik Yak is?
I'm sorry, Kimberly, I didn't
No,
hear
that's
it.
okay. So she was asking about the role of social media and how that plays into this. But particularly, she was talking about Yik Yak. Are you guys familiar with Yik Yak?
Not
okay.
me.
So, Will, do you know Yik Yak? Tell us what Yik Yak. I mean, I had to go look at it because I had never heard of it before. So, but Yik Yak is a new social media platform. And what is Yik Yak?
Sounds like the twin of TikTok.
I know, right?
Yik Yak. Okay.
Okay, basically, it's a social media app where people can post little kind of tweet type of things, but they're completely anonymous and they're blasted to everyone in a 5-mile radius of you. So if you're on a college campus, the only Yik Yaks you can see are people on your campus or in your area, but it's completely anonymous and you can comment on them and upvote them and stuff.
So for example, I happened to look at it on a day when Colby's Wi-Fi went down. Remember that day? And you see a string of responses, and it looks like a Twitter feed almost, but you have no idea who these people are. Everyone is anonymous. So that, of course, opens up a whole different level of things that could happen beyond hey, why isn't Colby's Wi-Fi working? But beyond Yik Yak or other social media platforms, how does that play into these conversations, and what's the role and sort of the both positive and negative of things that we see with social media, and as we think about the freedom to think and the freedom to act?
I think this is a really central question, and it's a question you all are much, much better equipped to solve than we are. I mean, we're digital immigrants no matter what we do. I mean, I always say to Bernadine, if you don't know what to do, ask a 10-year-old. And one thing I've learned is if you ask the 10-year-old says you can Google that, and then I Google it, and then ask a 10-year-old. But the point is that you all are living it, and you're seeing it. But I would say a couple of things. It gets me back to this question of formal versus the soul. The formal right to speak is one thing. The soul of democracy is not just the right to vote, for example. We need to defend the right to vote right now. It is at risk, it's serious, it's ongoing, but it's not just the right to vote. Let's go deeper. Let's ask ourselves, what is the soul of democracy that we want to protect? It's not just the right to vote, it's the importance of respecting other people. It's the importance of being in dialogue, not monologue, not constant monologues clashing with each other. How to solve that in the social media world, I have no idea. But I know we need to fight for the idea that there is such a thing as truth. It's not the same for everybody, but there is a world out there. I often think of this in terms of Bernadine and me going to the movies, because we've gone to the movies together for a long time, and I unfortunately have to often go alone because she won't go to a movie if it's sexist, racist, or violent. And I'm like, dude, what movie are you planning to go to? You know? But in any case, I did convince her to go see Avatar, Once Upon a Time. And we came out, and I was sobbing because I wanted to live on the blue planet. And she said, that was a racist, imperialist piece of shit. Now, we saw the same movie, so who was right? The point is, there is a world out there. We need to talk to one another based on evidence and argument, not based on, fantasy and just imagination. And I think that means that we have to fight for the idea that I want to see the evidence. I want to know more. I don't want a soundbite. I don't want something just coming at me quickly. I want to go deeper. You should demand that of yourselves. You should demand it of your students, and you should demand it of your colleagues and friends.
Yeah, I mean, we grew up in the early stages, just to remind you how, you have to talk to your grandparents to know this, early stages of television. That was the technology at the time, cowboy movies, family jokes, anyway, it was a pretty thin palette, actually, and not that helpful at opening up new worlds to us. But it did seem at the time that it was new worlds, and there was, comedians, and there was, comedians who pushed the margins of propriety and, broke through television rules about what kind of languages you could use. So I think that you have you use what's in front of you. You have, access to what's in front of you, and then you have to have kind of a conversation about what hurts other people. This is the issue about free speech. You can't really, without finding within yourself a way to speak up and protest, if the speech is hate speech, or if the speech exposes other people to, to traumatic events. And I'm very opposed to, having, to restricting, and having to do trigger warnings and things like that, because I think if you're in an environment of school and learning and education, you have to find ways to cope with things that are hateful, and you have to mainly learn to speak up in opposition if it's hateful, and that's really hard. I think for me, I always feel like my mother's sitting on my shoulder saying, "Be nice, and so for me, speaking up is an effort, and saying that's hateful, that's hurting somebody, stop, and that's part of the dialogue of new technology, I think.
But really it's two things. One is you have to have the courage to speak up, but the other is you have to have the courage to listen. And really dialogue is the fundamental pedagogy of democracy. Dialogue. Listening with the possibility of being changed, speaking with the possibility of being heard. It doesn't mean that you will always be heard. It doesn't mean you're always right. And it doesn't mean when you're listening that you're going to change your views 180 degrees. But you will learn something if you listen with the possibility of being changed and speak with the possibility of being heard.
But that's what
And
I was saying
dialogue.
about compassion. You
Yeah.
have to, when you speak up and somebody else is being heard, you have to think about that. We raised 3 boys. I used to think, what do they do in the locker room? How do they talk about other people in the locker room? Are they being pressured into being hateful to women, for example? And I think that that's just an example of where you're trying to teach by doing, by speaking up without being a complete jerk about it, without being self-righteous, without trying to shut somebody else down, but with trying to protect the people who may be being hurt.
Yeah.
There's no rules for that. That I think takes practice and a lot of talking with your friends and with your family.
And that gets to the kind of spirit of democracy or the soul of democracy more than the formality. We're from Chicago. The University of Chicago famously has a code for, that everyone should be able to speak, and we can invite any speakers we want. And when I read that code at the University of Chicago, and we know the people who wrote it pretty well, when I read that code, I think formally it makes sense. But it doesn't always make sense in terms of, what you do in that regard. For example, the dean of the law school, who's a friend, was saying, Ann Coulter has a right to speak here if the conservative club invites her. I agree with that. And I said back to the dean, but Dean, you have the right to lead the protest against her, not to ban her from speaking, but to say, I object to the content of what she's saying. Both are true. If the conservative club has the right to bring her, the students have a right to say, we object to your message, and we do not accept it. And I urged the dean to lead the crowd, but he wasn't interested. So it didn't happen. You see what I'm saying?
Let's get a few more questions from the audience before we wrap up. Here comes the hands. Wonderful. Let's get 2 questions. Yeah, Lynn, if you can come.
2 questions before we answer.
Yeah, exactly. Avery, you first, and then Lynn, can you come right here to you? Well, that's okay. We'll get you next. So Avery, and then the woman behind you. Avery, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Avery Marty. I'm a senior. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a government student. Something I wonder, and I liked what you had said about there is a truth, and kind of like pushing towards that, is how are we supposed to find it when there are a large amount of people operating on a completely different set of facts? And how do we engage in dialogue with people that don't seem to want to learn or engage with other opinions? I want to hear your thoughts on that.
And then just behind, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ainsley, and I just want to ask you to talk a little bit more about education and how, if we should all have our eyes open and be investigating and asking questions of the world, but we also are sitting up in an ivory tower that sort of reinforces itself in the way that it teaches us. How do you see education playing a role in a more free and just society?
Great. And then we'll get to the second round after this.
Maybe I'll take the education question first, but I really want to talk at some point about how do we search for the truth. But take the education question first, because I started teaching when I was 20 years old, and I've been a teacher my whole life. And I think that for me, education, I want to redefine education in our larger social political discussion as a human right, not as a product to be bought and sold at the marketplace, not as something that you kind of get if you have money or access, but it's something that just by being born, you should be able to find, not by jumping through hoops, you should be able to find a decent, fully funded, forward-looking, well-staffed school within reach. And every kid should have that. So the idea that we have a political discussion going on today about charter schools, vouchers, who gets access to what? Everyone should have access to education as a human right. In fact, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26 says, every child has a right to an education up to the standard of the culture that child lives in, and the education shall be based on human rights and the full development of the human personality. nothing about test scores, nothing about income. You know, and I endorse that. And I want to fight against the idea that education is a product. I also want to say to teachers that every kid who walks through that classroom door, you have to see that person as a three-dimensional creature, just like yourself, as an unruly spark of meaning-making energy on a voyage of discovery and surprise. And if you think of your kids that way, instead of as deficits or labels or all the stuff that we have a toxic habit of getting into, you can create an educational project that is very similar to the Freedom Schools. Question asking, seeing people as fully human, seeing people as people of agency, not as a collection of deficits to overcome. That's how I think about it, and I could go on,
Let
but
me
I
just,
won't.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, because I think at some point I taught for almost 20 years at Northwestern Law School, and I felt like we did so much great work, and I felt like, you know, I don't know. Anyway, the students, I remember them taking over at a meeting, a discussion, and saying, you know, the most important thing that happened to me here was that you made me go interview prisoners in Illinois who were sentenced as kids to life without possibility of parole. And that means that their actual, what they thought of as the most important thing didn't take place in my classroom, and it didn't even take place in the law school, but it took place in a project that came out of the law school by putting them, you know, into an environment that they never imagined that they'd walk into. They never imagined that they would go. Remember the first time I did this with a group of people, and we were looking at who were the people sentenced to life without possibility of parole. What a sentence. As soon as we abolished the death penalty in Illinois, that was the sentence. And you know, I had a little sheet that had 4 lines on it about who this man was. And he'd been arrested when he was 15 and for quadruple homicide. That's pretty much all it said. It also said he was probably retarded. And we got there and we went into this little visiting room, and he had a stack of books with him, law books that he brought that he wanted to talk to us about. And what was the quadruple homicide? It was an arson. And turned out he was innocent. And, you know, we went out of there saying, oh my God, you know, nobody represented him. He was a kid. Arson is very hard to prove, and it was not really looked at. Somebody was grabbed for it. And he was released within 4 months of our visit with him, because I called every lawyer I knew in Chicago. People wanted to take the case, but it unraveled the whole thing. But for my students, that's what they remember about law school. That's really what opened, not just that kind of miraculous one, but getting themselves, again, a little bit outside their comfort zone into another world, which was as unjust as you can imagine, which remains that way today.
What about the question on?
Yeah, I'll take that up really quickly. I mean, it's such a powerful question. We could stay here all night. Maybe we should, and we'll talk about that question of how do you then find the truth. I guess for me, there's a framework that's helpful. One is we have to know that there is no such thing as the truth, capital T, sitting on top of Mount Olympus, and we're simply trying to find it. We have to understand that truth is constructed, that it's contingent, it depends, and we've seen in our lifetime certainly, but even in your lifetime, we've seen new truths emerge because people demanded it. The way you seek the truth is by asking the next question and the next question and the next question, and by listening to people again and again and again. So look what's happened in our lifetime. If you'd said to me 20 years ago, gay marriage will be legal, I would have said you've lost your mind, because there's no way. But somehow a social movement, a group of people who were willing to take risks and then build a movement, and now it's as normalized as it could be. That's a new truth. That's a truth that was discovered through participation in a social movement. Again and again, I think we lose sight of the fact that what changes the world is ordinary people collectively acting in concert toward a new definition of what's possible. So if you just take a quick glance at American history, Lyndon Johnson was not part of the civil rights movement. He passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Why? Fire from below, a movement that was irresistible. Franklin Roosevelt was a patrician from the Hudson Valley, passed the most far-reaching social legislation. Why? Because there was a labor movement. And the most telling example is Abraham Lincoln. You haven't read his first inaugural address. You've only read his second, because the second is the one that lives on, because it could have been written by Frederick Douglass. That's the one where he condemns slavery and says every drop of blood drawn by the lash, we shall do an equal drop of blood drawn by the sword. His first inaugural address is when he talks about, I'm not going to upset your enterprise of slavery. I'm all in. Don't secede. By 4 years later, the world had changed. What had changed it? Fire from below. Self-liberating enslaved people, but also an abolitionist movement that couldn't be denied, and then a civil war. So, remember that, because it's not just the good ideas of the powerful, it's the important movement, it's the important fire from below that you and I have access to. It's not, we don't have access to the White House, you and I, but we do have access to the classroom, the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the neighborhood, the workplace. That's our access. That's our power. Let's not throw it away. Let's seek the truth there.
Let's do one last question before we end. Lynn, can you have the woman in the headband right here in the very front? Yeah, you see? And if we have time, well, you guys can answer quickly. We've had all female questions, which I think is a first. So I'll be kind, and there's a man in the back, with the red and the blue. We'll also do a question from you.
I think,
okay,
Kimberly, you're stuck in the binary, but never mind.
No, fair enough, fair enough.
Mind.
Thank you for pointing that out. Go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Darcy. I'm a junior. I'm a French and mathematics double major. And my question was, in my French studies specifically, I've noticed that a lot of Francophone countries actually ban certain books and movies from being published in their countries that are written by their own citizens. So there's a book that I'm currently reading called Les putes voilées n'iront jamais au paradis, which means veiled whores will never go to heaven. And it's a book out of Iran. And it's banned in Iran because it talks about prostitution and speaks for the voices of prostitutes who have been executed by the Islamic guards. There is a book, Ingratitude, which is based on Chinese traditional family dynamics and was banned in China, even though it was written by a Chinese author. So my question is, how do you think we should go about sort of rectifying or like addressing an issue like this, where it's censorship within somebody's own country?
Great question. And then to the person in the back.
Hi, I'm Silas. I'm a math and education double major, and I'm on the certification track for teaching. And I'm also doing some research with Adam Howard right now, which has really been awesome. And my question is continuing on the talk about truth, and how does art play into epistemology? As a mathematics major, my eyes have started to open to that, and I'm really interested in learning more about it.
What an interesting last two questions. Beautiful. Who wants to begin?
Well, I'd say a word about both. I mean, you said art, right? One of the things that impresses me endlessly is the ways in which the movement that has grown up today. People often say, I wish I were alive during the civil rights movement, I'd have been right there. Yeah, we'd all have been right there with Anne Frank, we'd all have been right there with, with John Brown, but right there is right now, and you can be part of the Black Lives Matter movement right now. You can be part of the immigration rights movement right now. It's within reach. One of the things that impresses me endlessly about the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago is how much it's tied up with art. Art and activism go together. And one of the things that's great about art, art isn't just decorations on the wall. Art asks you to see the world as if it could be otherwise. And I think that is something that these kids have deployed in so many remarkable ways to show us that there's openings and possibilities. I'm thinking of a guy that I worked with on a podcast for a long time and was killed in a tragic accident last summer. 26 years old, he had 2 little kids. But he was an artist, and he was an artist with music. He was an artist with his wife is a painter and a poet. And they found ways to deploy their art in the service of social justice that was so impressive. I think art opens vistas that didacticism does not. And so I appreciate that.
Can I just,
yeah, go ahead.
One of our favorite people in Chicago life and literature, of course, was Gwendolyn Brooks, who is no longer with us. But she wrote often about children and about children in the Black community in Chicago. And one of her poems is called Boy Breaking Glass, and I urge you to look it up. But it says, among other things, I shall create, if not a note, then a whole, if not an overture, then a desecration. And I think she's grabbing that notion of, opportunity, possibility, but breaking free in some way or another. And it's not always beautiful. It's often disruptive and difficult. I was addicted to the trials over the last year. I watched the trials that were done in Minneapolis. Well, 2 of them were done in Minneapolis, and the trial in Georgia, Arbery, Ahmaud Arbery trial. And I have to say, horrible, heinous crimes, and they gave me hope. And they gave me hope partly, I guess, because there were 3 verdicts that I was surprised at. I was surprised that a majority white jury would see what I saw in these various cases. But I think I'm arguing both for poetry and for kind of the notion of justice, holding on to some notion of justice and of equality.
How about the banned book question?
Well, I'm a big fan of reading banned books, and I kind of agree with the direction that you're pointing us to, that it's not just in this country. But what's shocking is that, I've talked to authors a lot in the last year or 2 who said, I expected my books to be banned in Iran or China. I didn't expect them to be banned in Iowa. And that's, in a way, I think that that's our first responsibility, is to take responsibility for our country. There's this very popular book that you might have read called Reading Lolita in Tehran, or there's another one called Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress. I think it's seamstress, I may be wrong. But these are books about book banning and the power of literature in totalitarian or more authoritarian societies. And I immediately want to say, look, one of the problems we have as Americans is the only literature you get in Portuguese or in Chinese is if somebody wins the Nobel Prize. Nobody read Jose Saramago in this country until he won the Nobel. Then he got translated into English. So we have a subtle form of censorship as well as a more overt, barbaric kind of form. I want to say reading Lolita in Tehran, fine. Let's talk about reading Lolita at Pat Robertson's University. That's also a problem. And for me, as an American, I want to look at our problems here first, because I think that's where we have access to really change things.
Yeah, can I just mention Toni Morrison as a writer who worked, it took a long time for her to be published and to be recognized. But one of her books that's not a novel is called Playing in the Dark. And what she's writing about is the way, what I think the subtitle is Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. So, what in American literature, for example, is where are the people of color in American literature? And they're there. They often don't have names. They're a shadow. They're not recognized as fully human. And so, and she's talking about the kind of stranglehold of whiteness on literature and on highly recognized literature in American life. So I just think there's so many great resources and so many great ways to look at how breakthroughs have been made and the demands of different people to have access to Broadway shows, to have access to being cast as different people. We just watched Macbeth at your little theater here, the wonderful theater in town. I'd urge you to see it. It's absolutely breathtaking, don't you think? We were both stunned by it. But we always go to the movies here because it's so cozy and friendly and big things of popcorn and lots of, don't you think? Yeah. You're looking at me weirdly, so I'm wondering.
No. Before we end, I want to thank you, Kimberly, and Sherry, and Hallie, and the Goldfarb Center, because you're doing such great work, and we were really
honored to
pleased
be here, really.
Yeah, well,
Thank
thanks to Professor Adam Howard for suggesting you, and to our, you know, he makes me think of our faculty committee, just how engaged they are. But also just want to say to our audience, our online audience, thanks for watching, thanks for coming out. Also, to the students that are here, you know, they're here all semester.
Yeah.
So they might be accessible if you're not taking class with them, if you just want to chat with them about other things.
Absolutely.
I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but
No,
I
we
just
love
have
it.
a feeling you don't
That's
mind.
why we're here. No, that's why we're here.
And how lucky we are to have visiting professors like this at Colby. It's one of the great perks of JanPlan and working at a place like this. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And I just want to end, I want to just, you had like, for someone who may not be as like hip on social media, you had like so many quotable things that if I was live tweeting, I would have just gone bananas. I hope somebody out there was.
Oh, she was.
But
There she
somebody,
was, yeah.
I hope you were tweeting everything he was saying. But I'll end with repeating some things that I hope stick to my mind, which is be astonished, do something, and keep opening your eyes. I think that's a great way for us to continue to think about freedom of speech and all of the elements that we think about. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.